The emergency alarm on Pacific Airlines Flight 837 was not a sound, it was a physical entity. It pierced the thin, recycled air of the cabin like a desperate metallic scream. A shriek of tortured machinery that vibrated through the floor, up the seat legs, and into the very bones of the 342 souls on board. Red lights flashed across the instrument panel in the cockpit, a frantic, silent disco of impending doom, as the Boeing 757, a marvel of modern engineering, gave up the ghost and plummeted in a gut-wrenching freefall. At 33,000 feet, the world outside the small oval windows was a serene, indifferent canvas of brilliant blue sky and pillowy white clouds. Inside, it was a Bosch painting of chaos and terror. In the cockpit, Captain James Richards, a man whose arrogance was as polished as his pilot's wings, was unconscious. A dark, viscous river of blood poured from a gash on his forehead, a gruesome testament to his head's violent meeting with the control panel during the first, catastrophic shudder of the aircraft. His co-pilot, a younger, less experienced man named Bradley, was alone at the controls, his hands shaking so violently that they seemed to blur. He wrestled with the yoke, his movements a frantic, useless dance against the unyielding, unresponsive machinery. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Pacific Airlines Flight 837. We have a complete loss of flight controls. I repeat, complete loss of control. Bradley's voice, usually a smooth, confident baritone, was now a high, reedy tenor, trembling with a sheer unadulterated panic that was more terrifying than the alarm itself. He was shouting into the radio, his words a desperate prayer sent out into the uncaring ether. Meanwhile, in the passenger cabin, 342 people were living what they knew, with a sudden gut-wrenching certainty, were the last moments of their lives. Oxygen masks, the cheerful yellow cups of life, swung violently from the ceiling panels like a gallery of hanged men. Carry-on luggage, freed from the overhead bins, flew through the aisles like deadly, unguided missiles. And the screams were a symphony of human terror, a multi-layered chorus of desperation, of prayers, of final, choked goodbyes. But there was one person on that plane who wasn't screaming. In seat 16A, Diana Foster, a 34-year-old black woman, remained preternaturally calm. Her seatbelt was buckled low and tight across her hips, her hands resting, almost placidly, on her thighs. She was watching the disaster unfold, not with the terror of a passenger, but with the cool, analytical, technical precision of someone who had spent 15 years of her life flying military fighter jets. Her dark, intelligent eyes were not fixed on the chaos inside the cabin, but on the world outside her window. She was automatically, instinctively, analyzing the angles of descent, the wind speed, the subtle, terrifying behavior of the control surfaces on the wing. She wasn't just a witness to the disaster, she was a student of it. She was calculating solutions. Just 2 hours earlier, in the sterile, bustling environment of the airport terminal, Diana had tried to introduce herself to the flight crew. As a certified commercial pilot and a former Air Force officer, it was standard, professional protocol to identify herself to the captain when flying as a passenger. It was a matter of courtesy, of safety, a way of letting the crew know there was another qualified pilot on board in the unlikely event of an emergency. The emergency was no longer unlikely, it was here. Captain Richards had barely glanced at her, his eyes, the color of faded denim, dismissing her with a casual, practiced contempt. He had looked at her pilot's license, then at her face, and a small, cruel smirk had played on his lips. "Oh sure," he had muttered to Bradley, his voice loud enough for Diana, and several other people at the gate, to hear clearly. "Another flight attendant who thinks she's a pilot." He had handed her license back without even really looking at it. "These diversity quotas are getting out of hand." Bradley, his eager two-piece co-pilot, had laughed, a loud braying sound that had made Diana's skin crawl. Next thing you know, he had chortled, playing to his audience. Of one, they'll be wanting women to fly aircraft carriers. 2. Diana hadn't responded. She had learned, through long and bitter experience, that responding to that kind of ignorance was like wrestling with a pig in the mud. You both get dirty, and the pig enjoys it. So, she had just smiled, a polite, cool, enigmatic smile, and headed for her seat, carefully storing the humiliation away. She had learned to use moments like that as fuel, and she had a feeling she would need that fuel someday. What those men, in their comfortable, unexamined privilege, didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have imagined, was that the woman they had just dismissed as a diversity quota had been the first black woman in the history of the United States Air Force to fly the F-2 Raptor. the most advanced fighter jet in the world, in active combat missions. They didn't know that she had over 3,000 hours of flight time, most of it in high-stress life-or-death situations. They didn't know that her military specialization had been something her instructors had called impossible emergency landings. Now, as the plane plummeted towards the earth, as the very same men who had despised and humiliated her were screaming for help in the cockpit, Diana Foster, with a calmness that frightened the passengers around her, unbuckled her seatbelt. Her movements were precise, economical, calculated. It was as if she already knew, with a chilling certainty, exactly what was going to happen next. A flight attendant, a young woman with terror-widened eyes, was stumbling down the aisle trying in vain to calm the panicked, screaming passengers. Diana gently, but firmly, took her by the arm. The young woman flinched, her eyes wild. I need to get to the cockpit, Diana said, her voice a calm, authoritative island in the ocean of chaos. Now, ma'am, all passengers must remain seated during an emergency, the flight attendant shouted, her voice competing with the deafening, soul-shaking roar of the alarms in the wind, screaming past the fuselage. Diana looked directly into the desperate woman's eyes. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't need to. I am a certified pilot, she said, her words clear, sharp, and undeniable. I am a former Air Force officer. If you want to have any chance of surviving this, you will get me to that cockpit. Do you understand? For a moment that stretched into an eternity, the flight attendant hesitated. She looked at Diana's face, at the absolute unshakable calm in her eyes, at the quiet, formidable authority in her posture, and then, something in her own training, in her own instinct for survival, kicked in. She saw not a passenger, but a commander. She nodded, her eyes still wide with terror, but now with a tiny, flickering spark of hope, and she began to make her way, pushing and stumbling, through the chaotic, debris-strewn aisle, clearing a path for the woman who was their only chance. Diana walked towards the cockpit, towards the very men who had so cruelly, so publicly, humiliated her. She couldn't help but feel a small, grim smile touch her lips. The irony was so thick, so potent, it was almost a physical taste in her mouth. The universe, it seemed, had a very dark, and very precise sense of humor, as Diana moved with a steady, determined grace down the aisle. The screams of the passengers and the deafening shriek of the alarms seemed to fade into a dull, distant roar. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of logic and control, was not focused on the chaos around her. It was replaying with a cold, forensic clarity every single painful second of the humiliation she had endured just 2 hours before. The boarding gate. Captain Richards had been even crueler, even more dismissive, than she had initially allowed herself to process. When she had approached the podium, her pilot's license in hand, he had been holding court with a small group of other Pacific Airlines pilots, a cliquey, self-satisfied fraternity of men in crisp, white shirts. When Diana had politely introduced herself, stating her name and her qualifications as per standard operating procedure, Richards hadn't even bothered to make eye contact. He had taken her license, glanced at it with a theatrical bored expression, and then turned to Bradley, holding it up as if it were a curious, amusing artifact. Look at this, Bradley, he had said, his voice laced with a mocking, exaggerated drawl. Another one of those diversity pilots. Fresh out of the box. They changed the rules, you know, lowered the standards. Now everyone gets a prize. He had chuckled, a low, rumbling sound of self-satisfaction. I bet she flew a Cessna 152, twice, in perfect weather, and now she thinks she's ready for Top Gun. Bradley, ever the loyal sycophant, had laughed, a sound that was too loud, too eager. Man, remember that woman last month, the one who said she was experienced. She almost crashed the plane just taxiing to the runway. These quotas, they're becoming a joke, a dangerous joke. Exactly, Richards had continued, finally turning his attention to Diana, his eyes sweeping over her with a look of open, undisguised contempt. He spoke to her as if she were a small, slightly dim-witted child. Honey, he had said, the word a slimy, condescending caress. I know you want to feel important. We all do. But this is serious business. This is a man's world. So why don't you just go find your seat, have a nice ginger ale, and let the men do the real work, okay? Diana had swallowed the bitter pill of humiliation in silence. She had learned long ago that to show anger, to show pain, was to give them a victory. So she had held her head high, her expression a mask of cool indifference, but inside, a familiar, Hot flame was igniting. They had no idea who they were belittling. They saw a black woman, and their tiny, prejudiced minds could not compute any other possibility beyond flight attendant, or diversity hire, or token. They could not conceive of the possibility that she was, in fact, more qualified, more experienced, and infinitely more competent than any of them. Diana Foster wasn't just any pilot. She was the only black woman to have ever commanded a squadron of F-22 Raptors on active rescue missions in hostile territory in Afghanistan. She had landed damaged, crippled fighter jets on makeshift bomb-cratered runways, under heavy enemy fire. She had more flight hours in extreme, life-threatening situations than Richards and Bradley had combined. But the worst, most public part of the humiliation was yet to come. As she had walked away from the podium, her face a mask of calm dignity, her heart a raging inferno, Richards had shouted after her, his voice loud enough for half the people in the terminal to hear, "Hey, princess, when you grow up and want to learn how to fly for real, come find me. Maybe I'll let you clean my cockpit." The laughter that had followed that final, brutal comment had echoed through the entire terminal. It was a public slap in the face. Passengers had turned to look, their faces a mixture of curiosity and pity. Children had asked their parents what was so funny, and Diana had felt every single one of those pitying, curious glances, every whispered comment of poor girl, like a physical blow. Now, 2 hours later, as the flight attendant finally managed to wrench open the cockpit door, Diana stepped into the small, chaotic space where the very same men who had so publicly, so cruelly, humiliated her were now fighting desperately, and failing, for their lives. The cruel, bitter irony of it all was so thick, so potent, it was almost suffocating. Bradley was alone at the controls, his face ashen, sweat pouring down his temples, his hand shaking so violently on the yoke that it was a miracle he hadn't dislodged it completely. Richards, the great, arrogant captain, lay unconscious in his seat, a dark, spreading stain of blood matting his silver hair, a deep, ugly gash on his forehead, where he had hit it during the first, violent turbulence that had sent the plane into its death spiral. "I can't do it. I can't do it." Bradley was screaming into the radio, his voice a raw, ragged sound of pure terror. "We've lost everything. Hydraulics, electrical, navigation, we're in a freefall. We're going down." When Diana entered the cockpit, Bradley looked up at her, his eyes wide with a desperate, primal fear. He didn't recognize her at first. He just saw a person, a potential savior. "Are you a pilot?" he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Please, for the love of God, tell me you know what you're doing." For a brief, fleeting moment, a moment of pure, human temptation, Diana considered reminding him. She considered reminding him exactly who she was. She considered mentioning the comments about diversity quotas, about princesses, about cleaning cockpits. She considered letting the full crushing weight of the irony of the situation descend upon him and break him completely. But then she looked past him, through the cockpit window, at the spinning, terrifying vista of earth and sky, and she thought of the 342 souls in the cabin behind her, their lives now hanging by the thinnest, most fragile of threads. And she knew that her personal feelings, her anger, her desire for vindication, were a luxury she could not afford. "Get out of the chair," she said, her voice a whip-crack of command, a voice that had sent hardened soldiers scrambling into action in the middle of a firefight. Her tone was so calm, so authoritative, that it contrasted brutally with his raw, uncontrolled panic. Now, Bradley hesitated for a second, his terror-filled eyes finally focusing, finally recognizing the face of the woman he had so casually, so cruelly, humiliated at the airport just a few hours before. The shock of recognition was a visible, physical blow. He recoiled as if he had been slapped. The same princess they had told to grow up, the same diversity hire they had laughed at, was now, quite literally, the only thing standing between him and certain, violent death. He stammered, his voice a choked, disbelieving whisper. "The diversity pilot who is about to save your life." Diana finished for him, her voice cold, sharp, and utterly devoid of emotion. She didn't have time for irony, she had time only for action. She pushed him aside and slid into the captain's seat, her movements precise, confident, and economical. Every new humiliation she had suffered in the last few hours, every condescending word, every dismissive glance, had only served to fuel something deep inside her, something those arrogant, small-minded men could never see, could never understand. A will of iron, a core of absolute, unshakable determination, forged in the fires of 1,000 battles they would never have the courage to face. What they didn't know, what they were about to learn in the most terrifying, most humbling way imaginable, was that every word of contempt, every act of prejudice, had only prepared the ground for this very moment. The moment when they would discover, once and for all, who was really in charge. Diana took control of the dying Boeing 757 with the cool, detached precision of a surgeon taking up a scalpel. Her fingers, long and elegant, slid across the instrument panel, her touch light but sure, her movements so familiar, so confident, that they left Bradley speechless. Every action was calculated, efficient, as if she had been born in that very cockpit, for that very moment. Stabilizing altitude at 28,000 feet, she murmured, her voice a low, calm monologue, more for her own benefit than for the terrified man beside her. She manually adjusted the flaps, her hands a blur of controlled energy. Main hydraulic system is dead, completely unresponsive. But the secondary system, the secondary is still responding. Faintly, she glanced at Bradley, her eyes cold and hard. Bradley, I need you to monitor the fuel pressure and the engine temperature. Report any changes to me, immediately. Can you do that? Bradley, his face still ashen, his hands still shaking, could only nod. He obeyed automatically, his mind struggling to catch up with the new, terrifying, and utterly surreal reality of his situation. 2 hours ago, he had been mocking this woman, laughing at her, dismissing her as a quota pilot. Now he was her subordinate, and his survival, and the survival of everyone on this plane, depended entirely on her. But what really haunted Diana, what fueled the cold, hard resolve in her heart, wasn't just the personal insults from Richards and Bradley. It was the complicity of the others. It was the memory of the other Pacific Airlines pilots at the gate, the ones who had laughed along, the ones who had nodded in agreement, the one who had discreetly filmed the incident on his cell phone, no doubt to share with the real pilots. In their private group chat, "Man, that was good," Captain Morrison, the 20-year veteran, had laughed. These women think flying a plane is like driving an Uber. And the worst part, the part that had cut the deepest, was the memory of Rebecca Walsh, the flight supervisor. She was one of the few women in a position of authority at the airline. She had walked past a group of laughing, preening pilots just as Richards had delivered his final, cruel, clean my cockpit line. She had seen the whole thing. She had heard it all, and she had done nothing. She had just lowered her eyes, her face a mask of uncomfortable neutrality, and quickened her pace, as if she hadn't seen or heard a thing. The sisterhood, the solidarity that Diana had so desperately, so naively, hoped to find in the male-dominated world of aviation, simply didn't exist when the prejudice came from the men at the top. Let her try, Richards had said, his voice full of a smug, self-satisfied certainty. When she crashes and burns on her first serious turbulence, she'll remember that a woman's place is serving coffee, not flying planes. Well, here she was, in the middle of the most serious turbulence of her life, and she was not crashing and burning. She was flying, Diana, Bradley said, his voice now quiet, respectful, the name a strange, unfamiliar sound in the chaos of the cockpit. I've never seen anyone take the controls like that. The way you just stabilized us. Where did you learn to do that? She didn't even look at him. She kept her eyes fixed on the instruments, on the horizon, on the 1,001 things that were trying to kill them. In places, she said, her voice as cold and as sharp as the thin air outside, where men like you and Richards would never, ever, dare to set foot. The truth was, Diana had left the Air Force not because of incompetence, but out of a deep soul-crushing frustration. After 5 years of serving her country, of saving lives, of flying the most advanced and dangerous missions, she had been passed over for promotion 3 times in a row. Each time, the promotion had gone to a white male pilot with less experience, with a worse flight record, with lower evaluation scores. The official explanation was always the same, a bland, corporate-speak excuse that was impossible to fight. Needs to develop more leadership skills, needs to demonstrate greater command over her troops. When she had finally, after years of fighting, received a promotion, it had been to a desk job, an administrative position, far away from the skies, far away from the action. It was, she had realized with a sickening clarity, a closet, a place where the most decorated female military officer in her class could be discreetly, quietly, forgotten. It was then that Diana had made the most difficult, most painful decision of her life. She had resigned her commission, she had left her military career, the only life she had ever known, and had decided to try her luck in civilian aviation. She had thought, naively, that in the private sector, merit would speak louder than prejudice. How wrong, how tragically wrong. She had been. Critical fuel leak, Bradley announced, his voice sharp with a new panic, interrupting her dark memories. Left engine. We have maybe 15 minutes of flight time, at most. Diana looked out the cockpit window. Below them, a vast, unforgiving wilderness of snow-covered mountains and dense, dark forests stretched to the horizon. There were no major airports for at least 300 kilometers in any direction. They were in the middle of nowhere, but there was something she had noticed on the flight map during the pre-flight safety briefing, a piece of information that her military training had taught her to always memorize. A small, abandoned military airstrip, a relic of the Cold War, built in a hidden valley and long since forgotten by modern civilian flight maps. Bradley, she said, her voice once again a whip crack of command. I want you to contact Denver Air Traffic Control. Tell them we are declaring a maximum emergency. Tell them we need all available rescue resources directed to the coordinates I am about to give you. What coordinates? Bradley asked, his voice full of confusion. There's nothing in this region. The map is blank. Diana adjusted the plane's course with a smooth, determined movement of the controls. Trust me, she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Or would you rather I wake up Captain Richards and have him take over? Bradley glanced at the still unconscious, bleeding captain, and then back at Diana. He shook his head quickly. No, he said, his voice a whisper. No, you're in charge. For the first time since she had entered the cockpit, Diana allowed herself a small, grim, genuine smile. Now you understand, she said. What Bradley didn't know, what he couldn't possibly understand, was that Diana wasn't just flying the plane. She was executing a plan that had begun to form in her mind, in the deepest, most strategic corners of her brain. The very moment that Captain Richards had so cruelly, so publicly, humiliated her at the airport, it was not a plan for revenge. It was something much more powerful, much more profound. It was a plan for total, irrefutable, undeniable redemption. Every movement she made on the controls, every command she gave, every calculation she performed, was designed not only to save the plane, but to prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the men who had despised her, who had dismissed her, had made the biggest, most catastrophic mistake of their professional lives. The woman they had called a princess, the woman they had told to grow up, now held in her skilled, steady hands not only the lives of 342 people, but the professional fate, the entire future, of every single man who had ever doubted her competence. And Diana Foster was about to turn the most painful, most public humiliation of her life into the most spectacular, most legendary victory that the world of civilian aviation had ever witnessed. With only 12 minutes of fuel remaining, a thin, gray scar appeared in the vast, white expanse of the mountains below. It was the abandoned military runway, a ghost from a forgotten war, emerging from the wilderness like a whispered promise of salvation. It was 1,200 meters of cracked, weathered concrete, surrounded by dense, unforgiving pine forest. It was, Diana knew with a cold, professional certainty, exactly half the length of runway that a Boeing 757 would normally require for a safe landing. That's Axis suicide, Bradley muttered, his voice a low, horrified whisper. His hands, which he had placed on the secondary controls, were slick with sweat. No commercial pilot in the world would attempt that. It's impossible. Diana manually adjusted the flaps, her eyes, narrowed in intense concentration, calculating impossible angles of descent, her mind a supercomputer of wind speed, drag, and velocity. You're right, she said, her voice calm, her focus absolute. No commercial pilot would attempt that. What Bradley, in his terror, didn't understand was that Diana Foster was not just a commercial pilot. She was a warrior. She was a war veteran who had landed crippled, burning fighter jets on makeshift, bomb-cratered runways in the middle of the night, under heavy enemy fire, in the mountains of Afghanistan. She had commanded rescue missions where a single tiny miscalculation would have meant instant, fiery death for her and her entire team. This was not a commercial landing. This was a combat operation. Mayday, 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 this is flight 837 on final approach for an emergency landing, Bradley transmitted, his voice breaking with the strain, his words a final, desperate plea to the world. A voice, crackling with static, came back through the radio. Flight 837, this is Denver Tower, we are reading you. Confirm your intention to land on abandoned military runway. Section 16, be advised, that runway is not authorized for commercial aircraft. I repeat, not authorized. Diana took the radio from Bradley's trembling hands. Her own voice was clear, firm, and resonant with an authority that cut through the static and the fear. Denver Tower, this is Commander Diana Foster, United States Air Force, retired. I am exercising my authority under Federal Aviation Regulation 91.3, which grants a pilot in command final authority and responsibility for the operation and safety of the flight. I am declaring a state of maximum emergency, and I am assuming full and complete responsibility for this operation. Do you copy, Denver Tower? A tense, crackling silence filled the radio. For a long, agonizing moment, there was no response. Then a new voice, calmer, more professional, came on the line. Commander Foster, this is Denver Tower Supervisor. We have confirmed your identification and your military service record in our files. Your clearance for an emergency landing on military territory is granted. Godspeed, Commander. Good luck. Bradley looked at Diana, his eyes wide with a new, dawning profound respect. Commander, he whispered. The word, a question, an exclamation, an apology, all at once. You're a military officer. At that moment, Captain Richards began to regain consciousness. He moaned softly, his hand going to the deep, bloody gash on his forehead. He tried to focus his blurry, pain-filled eyes. Where are we? He groaned. Richards, Bradley said, his voice now trembling with a mixture of terror and a strange, new reverence. The passenger, the woman, she's an Air Force commander. She's trying to save us. Richards struggled to sit up, his face a mask of confusion and pain. His eyes found Diana in the captain's seat, her hands moving with a calm, fluid grace over the controls. And then, slowly, horribly, the full, crushing realization began to dawn in his muddled, concussed mind. The same woman he had so cruelly, so publicly, humiliated, the woman he had called a princess and had told to grow up, the woman he had dismissed as a diversity hire. She was now commanding a landing operation that he, with all his years of experience, would never, ever have dared to attempt. No, Richards whispered, the color draining completely from his face, leaving it a pasty, sickly gray. It can't be. Diana kept her eyes fixed on the instruments, on the rapidly approaching runway. She didn't have time for their shock, for their dawning horror. She had a job to do. 6 minutes to impact, she said, her voice a cold, sharp instrument of command. Bradley, I want you monitoring our descent speed. Call it out every 10 knots. Richards, if you can stay conscious, I need you to watch the hydraulic pressure. The secondary system is failing. Tell me the second it goes into the red. The plane cut through the low-lying clouds, revealing the military runway below. It was a narrow, impossibly short line of gray, a defiant, man-made scar on the pristine, white canvas of the wilderness. Diana adjusted the controls with a surgical, almost delicate, precision. Each movement was the product of thousands of hours of experience, of muscle memory forged in the crucible of 100 impossible situations. Speed, 180 knots, Bradley called out, his voice, now a mesmerized, almost hypnotic, chant. 170, 160, he was no longer a co-pilot. He was a spectator, witnessing a level of absolute, transcendent competence that he had never before imagined was possible in the passenger cabin. A deadly, profound silence had taken hold. The 342 passengers, who had been screaming and praying just minutes before, were now frozen in a state of terrified, hopeful awe. They could feel the plane descending at an angle that defied everything they knew about commercial flight, yet somehow, it was maintaining a strange, terrifying stability, a sense of being in the hands of someone who was in absolute, total control. 50 meters, 40, 30. Bradley continued the countdown, his voice now filled with a mixture of pure, unadulterated awe and a primal, gut-wrenching terror. At the last possible second, Diana pulled the nose of the massive plane up, executing a perfect, textbook flare that softened the impending impact. The main wheels of the landing gear touched the cracked, weathered concrete with a deafening, soul-shaking roar, followed a split second later by the nose wheel. Immediately she slammed the reversed thrusters on with full, brutal force. The Boeing 757, a 100-ton behemoth, slid down the impossibly short runway like a bullet, sparks flying from the overheated wheels, the smell of burning rubber filling the cockpit. Diana maintained complete, absolute control of the aircraft, her feet dancing on the rudder pedals, making tiny, precise micro-movements to keep the plane from skidding off the narrow strip of concrete and into the dense, unforgiving forest. With only 50 meters of runway remaining, the plane, with a final, groaning shudder, came to a complete stop. Absolute, profound, life-altering silence filled the cockpit. Bradley stared at Diana, his mouth agape, as if he was seeing a ghost, a goddess, an angel of deliverance. Her own hands, now that the adrenaline was beginning to recede, were shaking violently as she removed her headset. I've never seen anything like that, Bradley whispered, his voice full of a reverence that bordered on worship. In my entire life. Richards, now completely lucid, was in a state of deep, catatonic shock. The man who, just 2 hours earlier, had so arrogantly, so confidently, mocked her as a quota pilot, had just witnessed the most technically perfect, most courageous, most impossible landing of his entire 20-year career. How, he asked, his voice a broken, defeated whisper. How did you do that? Diana methodically, calmly, shut down the main systems of the aircraft. Each precise, efficient movement was a silent, damning testament to the very competence that these men had been too arrogant, too blind, to recognize. 15 years of military training, she said, her voice quiet, but each word landing like a hammer blow. 5 years commanding combat missions. 3,500 hours of flight time in extreme life or death conditions. She turned in her seat then, and faced them directly, her eyes cold and clear. Everything, she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper, that you could have found out, if you had just bothered to look at my qualifications, instead of assuming I was just another diversity pilot. The cockpit door burst open, and the young flight attendant entered, her face streaked with tears of relief and gratitude. Commander Foster, she sobbed, her voice thick with emotion. All passengers are accounted for. Everyone is safe. Emergency services are on their way. Commander Foster, Richards repeated, the title, the reality of it, finally, crushingly, hitting him with the force of a physical blow. You really are, the first black woman to command F-22 fighters in hostile territory, Diana added calmly, finishing his sentence for him. Awarded the Medal of Honor for 5 successful rescue missions in Afghanistan, a certified Air Force instructor for extreme emergency landings. Bradley buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with a mixture of relief and a deep, profound, soul-crushing shame. My God, he whispered, what have we done? Outside, the wail of ambulance and fire engine sirens grew closer. The flashing red and blue lights began to illuminate the dark, silent cabin. But inside the cockpit, a different kind of light was dawning. A harsh, unforgiving light of truth. The weight of their complete, public humiliation, and the undeniable, irrefutable fact of a justice served at the perfect, ice-cold temperature, hung in the air. You called me a princess, Diana said, rising from her chair with an absolute, unshakable dignity. She looked directly at Richards, her gaze unwavering. You said that women like me are only good for cleaning cockpits. She paused, letting the words hang in the silent, charged air. Well, she said, her voice quiet but devastating, I just cleaned up your mess. Richards tried to speak, to apologize, to offer some kind of pathetic, useless explanation, but the words wouldn't come out. His throat was tight with a shame so profound it was suffocating. The woman he had so publicly, so cruelly, disparaged had just saved his life, and the lives of 341 other people, with a display of skill, of courage, of sheer breathtaking competence, that he knew, in the deepest, most honest part of his soul, he could never, ever hope to match. As the rescue crews approached, as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in, a single, undeniable truth echoed in the silence of that cockpit. The same competence they had been too arrogant, too blind, to recognize was now impossible to ignore, and the whole world was about to find out exactly who the real professionals in that cockpit were. 6 months after the miraculous landing that saved 342 lives and became an international news story, Diana Foster stood on the main stage of the International Aviation Convention in Geneva. She was receiving a standing ovation from an audience of more than 5,000 pilots, airline executives, and aviation experts from around the world. Ladies and gentlemen, the president of the World Pilots Association announced, his voice booming through the vast auditorium, I present to you Captain Diana Foster, the first person in the history of civil aviation to successfully perform an emergency landing of a commercial airliner on an abandoned, unpaved military runway, without the loss of a single life. The ovation, a thunderous, rolling wave of applause, lasted for a full 4 minutes. The flashes of hundreds of cameras lit up the auditorium like a lightning storm as Diana, now wearing the crisp, official uniform of a Pacific Airlines captain, the very same company where she had been so cruelly humiliated, walked with a quiet, absolute dignity to the microphone. 7 months ago, she began, her voice clear and strong, echoing through the now silent auditorium. 2 men, 2 colleagues, told me that a woman's place was serving coffee, not flying planes. She paused, allowing the simple, powerful words to sink in. Today, she continued, a small, confident smile touching her lips. I am the head of Pacific Airlines' new emergency fleet and rapid response division, and I train other pilots for extreme situations. In the audience, hidden in the back rows, a man who was once Captain James Richards watched, his face buried in his hands. After the emergency landing, the internal investigation by Pacific Airlines had revealed not only his technical incompetence during the crisis, but a long-documented history of discriminatory and misogynistic behavior, corroborated by several other female employees who had been emboldened by Diana's story to finally come forward. The administrative inquiry had also discovered that Richards had falsified flight hours on his resume and that his commercial pilot's license had, in fact, technically expired 2 years earlier. The company, desperate to avoid a bigger, more damaging scandal, had quietly fired him for disciplinary reasons. No other airline in the world would hire him. Bradley, for his part, had been demoted to co-pilot on short-haul domestic flights, a humiliating and career-ending demotion. During the internal depositions, several of his colleagues had reported his long-standing misogynistic and racist behavior, including the incident at the airport, which had been partially filmed by a passenger and had subsequently gone viral. On social media, under the hashtag #prejudicepilot. Aviation is not about gender, Diana continued from the stage, her voice ringing with a new, powerful authority. It is not about color. It is not about social background. It is about one thing, and one thing only, competence. It is about training, and it is about the courage to make the right decisions, under the most extreme pressure. The transformation at Pacific Airlines had been radical, and it had been swift. The company, which had initially tried to downplay the scandal, had been forced by immense public pressure to completely reevaluate its corporate culture and its hiring policies. Diana was not only promoted to chief pilot and captain, but was also asked to head the company's new diversity and excellence in aviation program. 9 women and 15 people from ethnic minorities have joined our pilot team in the last 6 months. The CEO of Pacific Airlines had proudly announced at a press conference the previous week, and our safety incident rate has dropped to 0 since we implemented the new training protocols developed by Captain Foster. The training program that Diana had created, based on her extensive military experience and her deep understanding of human factors in high-stress situations, had become a global benchmark. Airlines from 43 different countries had requested licensing for her methods. The Foster Protocol was now mandatory reading in aviation schools around the world. On the stage at the convention, Diana looked directly into the camera that was broadcasting her speech live to 120 countries. To every young black girl who has ever been told that she wasn't leadership material, she said, her voice full of a quiet, powerful passion. To every woman who has ever heard that she didn't have the right profile for a job, I say this to you: your competence will always speak louder than any prejudice. The audience erupted in applause again. On social media, the video of her speech was already racking up millions of views, with comments from women all over the world sharing their own stories of overcoming adversity, of fighting against prejudice, of proving the doubters wrong. Rebecca Walsh, the supervisor who had so shamefully witnessed Diana's humiliation at the airport and had done nothing, had resigned from Pacific Airlines a week after the incident. In a candid interview with a national newspaper, she had admitted, with a painful, public honesty, I didn't have the courage to stand up for what was right. And living with that cowardice, after seeing her greatness, her courage, made it impossible for me to continue at the company. 3 of the 4 pilots who had so gleefully laughed at Diana's humiliation at the gate had been transferred to night cargo flights, the lowest, most undesirable position in the commercial aviation hierarchy. The 4th had requested a transfer to another company when his own colleagues, disgusted by his behavior, had begun to socially isolate him. But the most important change, Diana continued, her voice softening, did not happen in corporate meeting rooms or in training manuals. It happened in the minds of an entire generation of young people, who now know that the sky has no gender and it has no color limits. The Diana Foster Foundation for Inclusive Aviation, which she had created with the substantial prize money from the international award she had just received, had already awarded full aviation scholarships to 230 young women from marginalized and underprivileged communities. 15 of them had already graduated and were now working as commercial pilots. Richards, still hidden in the back of the audience, rose discreetly and began to make his way towards the exit. He couldn't watch anymore. His own arrogance, his own small-minded prejudice, had created the very legend that now haunted his every waking moment. In the private WhatsApp groups for pilots, his name had become a verb, a synonym for incompetence and disgrace. Don't pull a Richards on this one. His wife, humiliated by the public scandal, had filed for divorce. There is one final lesson that I learned on that terrible and wonderful day, Diana said, concluding her speech, her voice ringing with a final, profound truth. The best revenge is never to destroy those who have hurt you. The best revenge is to become so extraordinarily, so undeniably, competent, that the very existence of your success exposes the smallness of those who doubted you. Diana stepped off the stage to a 10-minute standing ovation. Reporters immediately surrounded her, shouting questions, but she walked straight past them, her eyes fixed on a group of 15 young women, all of them black, Latina, and Asian, waiting for her at the side of the stage. They were all wearing their brand new Pacific Airlines pilot uniforms. Ready for your first flight as captains? Diana asked them, her face breaking into a wide, brilliant smile. Yes, ma'am, they replied in perfect, proud unison, their faces shining with the knowledge that they were making history. As they walked together towards the hangars, a new generation of pilots, led by their hero, Diana thought, for a fleeting moment, of Richards and Bradley. She felt no anger, she felt no cruel satisfaction at their downfall. She felt only a faint, distant pity for men so small, so insecure, that they needed to belittle others in order to feel big. Diana Foster's real victory was not in landing a crippled plane in impossible conditions. It was in proving to the entire world that competence and character and courage will always, in the end, win out over prejudice and arrogance. If this story of overcoming adversity and finding justice touched your heart, subscribe to the channel to discover more real stories of people who turned their greatest humiliations into the fuel for their greatest triumphs. Because sometimes, the injustice we suffer today is just the universe's way of preparing us for the glory we so richly deserve tomorrow.